welcome to our Bloomsday 2021 event. The Consulate General of Ireland in Atlanta is delighted to partner with Arís Theatre to bring you this celebration of the work of James Joyce in praise of women. We are celebrating Bloomsday, named after the main character in Ulysses, Leopold Bloom, on the day depicted in Ulysses, the 16th of June, and we're coming to you from the historic sanctuary at the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Atlanta. We will celebrate Joyce's work beyond Ulysses, with readings, music, and analysis from a wide range of pieces, all visiting Joyce where he writes about, for, and in the voices of women. We're delighted to have Geraldine Higgins of Emory University with us, and we're especially thrilled to have as our guest of honour author Nuala O'Connor to talk about her book, Nora, a reimagining of the life of Nora Barnacle, Joyce's wife and muse, and the inspiration for the character of Molly Bloom in Ulysses. First, we will begin with a lament. She weeps over Rahun. Rahun is located on the edge of Galway City, where Nora Barnacle grew up. Joyce was fascinated with the young loves of his wife, and this poem seems to imagine her grief on the death of one of them. It is read by Sarah Keane, Vice Consul here in Atlanta.
Rain on Rahun falls softly, softly falling, where my dark lover lies. Sad is his voice that calls me, sadly calling, at grey moonrise. Dark to our hearts, O love, shall lie and cold, as his sad heart has lain, under the moon-grey nettles, the black mould and muttering rain. Love, hear thou, how soft, how sad his voice is ever calling, ever unanswered, and the dark rain falling, then as now.
Every morning, I lay on the floor of the front parlour watching her door. The blind was pulled down to within an inch of the sash so that I could not be seen. When she came out on the doorstep, my heart leapt. I ran to the hall, seized my books, and followed her. I kept her brown figure always in my eye, and when we came near the point at which our ways diverged, I quickened my pace and passed her. This happened morning after morning. I had never spoken to her except a few casual words, and yet her name was like a summons to all my foolish blood. Her image accompanied me even in places the most hostile to romance. On Saturday evenings when my aunt went marketing, I had to go to carry some of the parcels. We walked through the flaring streets, jostled by drunken men and bargaining women, amid the curses of labourers, the shrill litanies of shop boys who stood on guard by the barrels of pigs' cheeks, the nasal chanting of street singers who sang a camallie about O'Donovan Rossa or a ballad about the troubles in our native land. These noises converged in a single sensation of life for me. I imagined that I bore my chalice safely through a throng of foes. Her name sprang to my lips at moments in strange prayers and praises, which I myself did not understand. My eyes were often full of tears. I could not tell why. And at times, a flood from my heart seemed to pour itself out into my bosom. I thought little of the future. I did not know whether I would ever speak to her or not, or if I spoke to her. How could I tell her of my confused adoration? But my body was like a harp, and her words and gestures were like fingers running upon the wires.
Dusholto. A birdless heaven, sea dusk and a star, sad in the west. And thou, poor heart, love's image, fond and far, rememberest. Her silent eyes and her soft foam-white brow, and fragrant hair, falling as in the silence falleth now, dusk from the air. Ah, why wilt thou remember these, or why, poor heart, repine, if the sweet love she yielded with a sigh was never thine?
Gertie MacDowell, who was seated near her companions, lost in thought, gazing far away into the distance, was in very truth as fair a specimen of winsome Irish girlhood as one could wish to see. She was pronounced beautiful by all who knew her, though, as folks often said, she was more of a Giltrap than a MacDowell. Her figure was slight and graceful, inclining even to fragility, but those iron jelloids she'd been taking of late had done her a world of good, much better than the Widow Welch's female pills, and she was much better of those discharges she used to get, and that tired feeling. The waxen pallor of her face was almost spiritual in its ivory-like purity, though her rosebud mouth was a genuine Cupid's bow, Greekly perfect. Her hands were finely veined alabaster, with tapering fingers, and white as lemon juice and Queen of Ointments could make them, though it was not true that she used to wear kid gloves in bed, or take a milk footbath either. Bertha Supple told that once to Edie Boardman, a deliberate lie, when she was black out at daggers drawn with Gertie. The girl chums had, of course, their little tiffs from time to time, like the rest of mortals, and she told her not to let on whatever she did that it was her that told her, or she'd never speak to her again. No, honour where honour is due. There was an innate refinement, a languid, queenly hauteur about Gertie, which was unmistakably evidenced in her delicate hands and high-arched instep. Had kind fate but willed her to be born a gentlewoman of high degree in her own right, and had she only received the benefit of a good education, Gertie MacDowell might easily have held her own beside any lady in the land, and have seen herself exquisitely gowned with jewels on her brow, and patrician suitors at her feet, vying with one another to pay their devoirs to her. Mayhap it was this, the love that might have been, that lent to her softly featured face at whiles a look tense with suppressed meaning, that imparted a strange, yearning tendency to the beautiful eyes, a charm few could resist. Why have women such eyes of witchery? Gertie's were of the bluest Irish blue, and set off by lustrous lashes and dark, expressive brows. A time was when those brows were not so silkily seductive. It was Madame Vera Verity, directress of the Woman Beautiful page of the Princess Novelette, who had first advised her to try eyebrow line, which gave that haunting expression to the eyes, so becoming in leaders of fashion, and she had never regretted it. Then there was blushing, scientifically cured, and how to be tall. Increase your height, and, well, you have a beautiful face, but your nose, that would suit Mrs. Dignam, because she had a button one. But Gertie's crowning glory was her wealth of wonderful hair. It was dark brown with a natural wave in it. She'd cut it that very morning on account of the new moon, and it nestled about her pretty head in a profusion of luxuriant clusters. Pared her nails, too, Thursday for wealth, and just now at Edie's words as a telltale flush, delicate as the faintest rose bloom, crept into her cheeks. She looked so lovely in her sweet, girlish shyness that of a surety God's fair land of Ireland did not hold her equal.
Gabriel had not gone to the door with the others. He was in a dark part of the hall, gazing up the staircase. A woman was standing near the top of the first flight in the shadow also. He could not see her face, but he could see the terracotta and salmon pink panels of her skirt, which the shadow made appear black and white. It was his wife. She was leaning on the banisters, listening to something. Gabriel was surprised at her stillness and strained his ear to listen also. But he could hear little save the noise of laughter and dispute on the front steps, a few chords struck on the piano, and a few notes of a man's voice singing. He stood still in the gloom of the hall, trying to catch the air that the voice was singing, and gazing up at his wife. There was grace and mystery in her attitude, as if she were a symbol of something. He asked himself, what is a woman standing on the stairs in the shadow, listening to distant music, a symbol of? If he were a painter, he would paint her in that attitude. Her blue felt hat would show off the bronze of her hair against the darkness, and the dark panels of her skirt would show off the light ones. Distant music, he would call the picture, if he were a painter. The hall door was closed, and Aunt Kate, Aunt Julia, and Mary Jane came down the hall, still laughing. "Well, isn't Freddie terrible?" said Mary Jane. "He's really terrible." Gabriel said nothing, but pointed up the stairs toward where his wife was standing. Now that the hall door was closed, the voice in the piano could be heard more clearly. Gabriel held up his hand for them to be silent. The song seemed to be in the old Irish tonality, and the singer seemed uncertain, both of his words and of his voice. The voice, made plaintive by distance and by the singer's hoarseness, faintly illuminated the cadence of the air with words expressing grief. "Oh, the rain falls on my heavy locks, and the dew wets my skin. My babe lies cold." "Oh," exclaimed Mary Jane, "it's Bartel D'Arcy singing, and he wouldn't sing all the night." "Oh, I'll get him to sing a song before he goes." "Oh, do, Mary Jane," said Aunt Kate. Mary Jane brushed past the others and ran to the staircase, but before she reached it, the singing stopped and the piano was closed abruptly. In this scene from Joyce's most famous short story, The Dead, we find Gabriel Conroy lost in a moment of contemplation of his wife, Greta. Unnamed at first, she appears as a symbol of mystery and beauty. Gabriel uses verbal brushstrokes to paint the colours of her clothing and the light and shadow of her attitude. The final touch is when he asks himself, what is a woman standing on the staircase, listening to distant music, a symbol of? The focus is on the artist and his portrait of the unknowable woman. Distant music, the title of the painting, is a version of a still life, a literary still life, or as the French say, nature morte. Something extraordinary happens when we see this moment translated into film in John Huston's 1987 version of The Dead. We still find Greta lost in reverie on the staircase, but now we too can hear the song that she's listening to, that old lament of grief and loss, the Lass of Aughrim. It transports Greta back to her own childhood in the west of Ireland and sets the mood for the end of The Dead. Reversing the cliche that the book is always better than the film, here is a moment when we too can become immersed in the mood of the story. Like Gabriel Conroy, we are also transfixed by the grace and beauty of this still life come to life. So now let us contemplate Mary Seville in her version of The Lass of Aughrim.
If you be was cold within my arms, but none will let me in.
He pushed open the latchless door of the porch and passed through the naked hallway into the kitchen. A group of his brothers and sisters was sitting around the table. Tea was nearly over, and only the last second watered tea remained in the bottoms of the small glass jars and jam pots which did service for teacups. Discarded crusts and lumps of sugared bread turned brown by the tea that had been poured over them lay scattered on the table. Little wells of tea lay here and there on the board, and a knife with a broken ivory handle was stuck through the pith of a ravaged turnover. The sad, quiet, grey-blue glow of the day dying came through the window and the open door, covering over and allaying quietly a sudden instinct of remorse in Stephen's heart. All that had been denied them had been freely given to him, the eldest, but the quiet glow of evening showed him in their faces no sign of rancor. He sat near them at the table and asked where father and mother were. One answered, "Gone bra, to bra, look bra, at bra, bra, house bra." Still another removal. A boy named Fallon in Belvedere had often asked him with a silly laugh why they moved so often. A frown of scorn darkened quickly his forehead as he heard again the silly laugh of the questioner. He asked, "Why are we on the move again, if it's a fair question?" The same sister answered, "Because bra, the bra, land bra, lord bra, will bra, put bra, us bra, out bra." The voice of his youngest brother from the farther side of the fireplace began to sing the air, "Oft in the stilly night." One by one, the others took up the air until a full choir of voices was singing. They would sing so for hours, melody after melody, glee after glee, till the last pale light died down on the horizon, till the first dark night clouds came forth and night fell. He waited for some moments, listening, before he too took up the air with them. He was listening with pain of spirit to the overtone of weariness behind their frail, fresh, innocent voices. Even before they set out on life's journey, they seemed weary already of the way.
Slumber's chain has bound me, fond memory brings the light of other days around me. The smiles, the tears of boyhood's years, the words of love then spoken, the eyes that shone, now dimmed and gone, the cheerful hearts now broken. Thus in the steely night, ere slumber's chain has bound me, sad memory brings the light of other days around me. When I remember all the friends so linked together, I've seen around me fall whose lights are fled, whose garlands dead. And all but he, the stilly night, if slumber's chain has bound me, sad memory brings the light of other days around me.
We are now delighted to welcome our special guest for this year's Bloomsday celebration, author Nuala O'Connor. Nuala is based in County Galway in Ireland and has published a number of novels and short stories over the course of her literary career. In 2019, she won the James Joyce Quarterly competition to write the missing story from Dubliners, Ulysses. Nuala's latest novel about Nora Barnacle, wife and muse to James Joyce, has just been released to great acclaim in the US and Europe. Nuala will share some of her thoughts on the writing process, Joyce's portrayal of women, and more. Nuala will also give us an exclusive reading from Nora. So let's jump right in and hear from Nuala herself on what inspired her to write Nora.
I moved to Galway 25 years ago from Dublin, and I was already aware of Nora Barnacle as the earthy, dynamic, strong wife and muse to James Joyce. I used to go to the annual Bloomsday celebration at the Nora Barnacle Museum in Bowling Green in Galway, where there would be a keg of beer and everybody would read pieces from Ulysses and sing and talk, and actors would act out scenes with Nora and Jim. I had read Brenda Maddox's biography of Nora in my teens and loved it. And I had seen a little later Pat Murphy and Jerry Stembridge's beautiful film Nora, starring Ewan McGregor and Susan Lynch. So I was very aware of this woman. But it wasn't until a few years ago, I was studying Italian by night in NUI Galway, and I had to write an essay about Joyce's time in Trieste and his friendship with his friend, the writer Italo Svevo. And as I was doing the research for it, all I was doing was squinting over Joyce's shoulder to see what Nora was up to, and having a large thought process about Nora's life and what it must have been like to live with the genius Joyce, to travel so much, to always be on the move. My research was specific, but also very, it comes from curiosity, I suppose. And I do like to write about feisty women who have been smudged a bit by history and bring them back into the limelight. And it's an act of love, really. I love Nora, and I loved Belle and Emily Dickinson, the other women I wrote novels like this about. And so it's a way to honour them, respect them, and bring them to other people in order that they might love them. So that's my aim. The research was vast. I mean, there's so much written about Joyce. Think of any aspect of James Joyce and there's a book or a essay or an academic paper written on it. So I had no end of wonderful research to draw on. So I reread the Maddox biography of Nora. I read Ellman's biography of Joyce, which is comprehensive, huge, wonderful. I read any other biographies I could get my hands on. I read Stanislaus Joyce, that's Joyce's brother, his books. I read the biography of their father. I read, actually there's a book written about the Nora film, also simply called Nora. I read that. I read Pádraig O'Leary's short biography of Nora. It's a very Galway-based book. It was published by Kenny's Bookshop. So, and then I went and looked at any other aspects. I read the biography of Lucia Joyce. I read their letters. I read their friends' books. So Frank Budgeon, the artist, was their friend. Pádraig and Mary Cullum were their friends. So I read their testimonies of what it was like to be friends with Nora and James Joyce. So yeah, I read widely. And then the other part of the research, of course, is the travel. I was very lucky that the Arts Council gave me money to go to Europe. So I went to Trieste and I went to Zurich. I'd been to Zurich before, but I had never been to Trieste, and it was the thing that surprised me. It was so beautiful, almost like a hidden gem in terms of what we're fed as potential tourists to Italy. It's called the Jewel of the Adriatic, and it's really easy to see why. It's this beautiful, light, bright place, has a beautiful, huge palazzo, you know, these gorgeous pale coloured buildings. The sea is there twinkling away. It was a very multicultural, vibrant port town in Joyce and Nora's day. It has lost a bit of that, but it has retained all of its charms. It's built sort of up into the back of the Carso, the hills behind it, and it's just stunning. So that was a gorgeous part of the research. I just felt incredibly happy there, and I could see Nora and Jim's ghosts around every corner. I could feel myself following their footsteps. So what I do when I go to these places, and I also had a month-long residency at the Centre Culturel in Paris, which was fantastic. I finished writing the book there. What I do is I literally do walk around. So the Joyces lived at 19 different addresses, I should say, in Paris alone. And so I went around those places, looked at the buildings, got inside them as best I could when I could. And I also went to their haunts, any churches that have entered, you know, out of interest. Joyce wasn't religious, but he loved a church. And I went to the cafes that they frequented. Often I couldn't really frequent them myself because they're quite posh places. The Joyces always had very high taste. So yeah, just a wonderful sort of trailing around after them and trying to catch their scent. The thing is that, as we know, a lot of European cities haven't changed much despite 2 world wars. So there really is a sense of the history has remained, and you can embrace it when you go there. So I didn't want Nora to be a parody of Molly Bloom as such. Molly is very much her own person, and I think she's an amalgam for Joyce. Joyce also based Nora on Bertha in Exiles, and also probably on the voices and phrases of his sisters, his Aunt Jo, probably what he remembers of his mother. So I say he drew heavily on a lot of the women in his life. But I do think that Nora was a model for, you know, she definitely was a model for Bertha, Greta, Molly, all of these people. But she was very much her own person. And I suppose to Joyce, she was probably exotic in a sense because she was from rural Ireland. Okay, she was from Galway City, but it was a small port city in those days. Bustling and busy, yes, but also hugely influenced by the Irish language and Irish culture, which came to its gates from Connemara. So Joyce was from the more cosmopolitan, more British influenced Dublin. And so the two things were quite different and still are. There's a very different, like Galway is a medieval town. The streets are built on a medieval pattern. And so it feels very different and very small compared to Dublin. Dublin has a sort of a greyness that it can't shake off. And it's my hometown and I love it. And I say that, you know, not as a criticism, it just has that. Probably to do with the architecture. But Galway has a sort of a lighter, brighter, it's something to do with the light in from the Atlantic. So quite a contrast. And Nora had been brought up by her grandmother. She was sort of a very naturally good-humoured, charismatic person, full of fun, full of song and story, which were things that Jim was also full of. They were both great singers and storytellers and entertainers. In terms of creating her voice, this is all to do with tone, and you have to sort of get the tone right before you can begin. And I was walking down the road here in Ballinasloe one day where I live, and the first line just came to me. And once you have that sound in your ear of what the voice is going to be. And I have her as sort of, she's one part sort of cheeky devil, and she's another part reflective and serious and full of emotion, you know, which I believe is the way she was. When you read her letters, you get a bit of that. So I used testimony, her letters, and then invention. I suppose that's the novelist's job. That's how I got her voice. I think there is a feminist angle in the sense that she's front and centre in the novel, which is often not the case when we read novels about writers' wives. Often the writer's wife is also a frustrated writer, and the novel is in terms of maybe how she was obliterated by the man and his writing. But Nora had no ambitions to be a writer. She was not a literary person. She liked penny dreadfuls. She liked the erotic writings of Sacher Mossack. You know, she had her own tastes. So she was no threat to Joyce in that sense, and yet she brought this mouthful of stories to his table that he used and loved using. And she probably laughed at this, but loved it at the same time, because it was a way of honouring her and immortalising her as well. So the feminist angle, I suppose, is the fact that she is the main character. It is a first-person narrative. It's her voice. It's her story. It's her version of Jim. It's her version of her children. Nora has been criticised in the past for her treatment of Lucia, her alleged treatment of Lucia, her alleged neglect of her daughter, but I don't buy into that narrative at all. And the evidence I have is that she loved her daughter deeply and wanted to help her when she was diagnosed with schizophrenia and hospitalised and institutionalised indeed for years. There's a sort of a posse that think that Nora wasn't good enough to Lucia, but the Joyces, did everything they could to help their daughter. And as a mother myself, I know that Nora's love for Lucia was great. Like, we shouldn't forget that Lucia was violent, and she was an adult when she was diagnosed, and her care was left to Nora because obviously Jim was writing and socialising. So it was up to Nora to deal with this person. And Lucia would have been very strong. She was a dancer, so she was very lithe and strong. So not an easy thing to be dealing with. And I think she dealt with it as best she could. I think for anyone who's read Ulysses, the relentless misogyny in the book can become a bit much. You know, it's a book of genius, a book of humour, a book of so many different styles. It is a magnificent book, you know, truly one of the most enjoyable books I've ever read. But the misogyny in it is real. Now, you can look at that two ways. Is Joyce criticising his era and its misogyny, or is it something more personal? When you read about Joyce and about his support by women, the likes of Sylvia Beach, Harriet Weaver, Mrs. Rockefeller in Zurich, his absolute love for his Aunt Jo, his supporting of his own sisters who he brought over to Trieste, Eileen and Eva, his constant, in his letters, praise of Nora. He found something very noble in her, and he said if he were to write anything good, he would do so by listening at the doors of her heart. He was a man full of love. And I remember at one point Stanley criticised Nora in a letter, and Jim wrote back and defended her stoutly and said, she's better than me. She has more nobility than me. She's much better able to cope with life than I am, which is probably true because of her natural sort of charisma and optimism, whereas Joyce was more of a worrier. He, believed people betrayed him all the time, etc., etc. He was quite sensitive in himself. So she was the perfect foil to him. She was, they were yin and yang. She was the water to his fire, I believe. So, yeah, I think she was hugely influential in his portrayal of women. He used her sort of run-on speaking style and her humour and her... I think these days we might have said she was unfiltered. I know Joyce's sisters were a little shocked when she put the po, as we used to call it, the potty, onto the top of the sideboard one time in Trieste. They were alarmed. The Joyces were the fallen genteel, and Nora was very much of a working class background. Her father was a baker. He had separated from her mother. Nora was brought up by her granny. So They came from sort of similar but different backgrounds. They both knew poverty, they both grew up in port towns, that kind of thing. But Nora was definitely of a different class. Now, the Joyces had lost their money due to Joyce's father. But yeah, they had a lot of things in common, but also there were differences between them. And so Nora's unfiltered, humorous way of speaking was very much to Joyce's taste. So I'm going to read a passage from Nora for you. This is, I suppose, they met in June 1904, famously on Nassau Street, and Joyce approached this beautiful auburn-haired woman who was striding so purposefully along, and then she stopped at a window and he joined her there and spoke to him. She thought he was Swedish. He had a sailor's cap on. He loved eccentric outfits. They both loved style, actually. So this is September 1904, so they know each other a bit by now. She's mad about him at this stage, and he's very, very taken with her as well. He won't say he loves her yet, which annoys her. It's a month before they elope and head off to Europe. They end up finally in Trieste, but they have a little bit of a journey before that. So this is Joyce and Nora. This chapter is called Memory. Though Jim is jealous of any other man whose mouth has met mine, he makes me talk of the two dead Michaels, Feeney and Bodkin, and poor Protestant Willie, who Uncle Tommy objected to so strongly. Jim loves details and takes meaning from everything, dates, songs, tiny occurrences, objects. Mostly Jim wears me out with his investigations into my life before I met him, but I play along anyway to please him. Tell me again about Feeney, Jim says. Jim and I are once more walking by the sea, this time at Sandy Cove, where his friend Oliver St. John Gogarty lives in a squat tower. I let the breeze lap over my face and remember Michael. He was never a robust young fellow. There was something of the lamb about him, I say. Lamb? Jim asks. What I mean is, Michael was pale-faced, sunken, always a little sick, but he was gentle and he could sing well. Feeney sang for you often, I suppose. Jim's nose wrinkles. Oh, he would sing the Lass of Aughrim and linger over the saddest parts. The pair of you were thwarted, Nora, a bit like the lovers in the song. Go on, tell me more, he says. I sit on the seawall. Ah, Jim, you have me repeating myself like some doting crone. Haven't I told you all this before? He sits by me and takes my hand. I like to hear these things, Nora. They're good yarns. Tell me again about the night of the rain. I spurt air between my lips to help me keep my patience. Okay, all right. I was in bed one wet night, the wind howling, when I heard stones hit my window. I looked out, and there was Michael Feeney under the tree, shaking with the cold. Go home, you'll catch your death, I said. I don't want to live if I can't see you, Nora, he called back. I ran out to Michael and embraced him and went back inside. A week later, he was dead. It was terrible, only a gossoon of 17. And you think you were the cause of his death, Jim says. My heart babbles in my chest. He shouldn't have been out on such a squally night. He was ailing. I dropped my head, and then, when Sonny Bodkin was taken by TB, well... Jim puts his arm around me and squeezes. His look is impish. Nora, my little man-killer. I shrug him off. It isn't funny, Jim. Dying is not one bit funny. It's not, Nora. Death descends so lightly, but it's the hardest thing of all. Long gone, Granny Healy floats across my vision like a blot in my eye. But, as she does in my dreams, she merely smiles. Jim's face slackens, and I know he's probably remembering his dear mother, just as I'm thinking of the only woman who was a real mother to me. We sit together on the seawall, letting the jounce of the waves Their grey-green light soothe and calm us while we conjure the dead.
The sun shines for you, he said. The day we were lying among the rhododendrons on Howth Head in the grey tweed suit and his straw hat, the day I got him to propose to me. Yes. First I gave him a bit of seed cake from my mouth. And it was leap year like now, yes. 16 years ago, my God. After that long kiss, I near lost my breath. Yes. He said I was a flower of the mountain. Yes. So we are flowers all of woman's body. Yes. That was the one true thing he said in his life. And the sun shines for you today. Yes. That was why I liked him, because I saw he understood or felt what a woman is, and I knew I could always get round him, and I gave him all the pleasure I could, leading him on, till he asked me to say yes. And I wouldn't answer first, only looked out over the sea and sky, and I was thinking of so many things he didn't know of. Mulvey, Mr. Stanhope, and Hester, father, and old Captain Groves and the sailors playing All Birds Fly and I Say Stoop and washing up dishes, they called it on the pier. And the sentry in front of the governor's house with the thing round his white helmet. Poor devil, half roasted. And the Spanish girls laughing in their shawls and their tall combs. And the auctions in the morning and the Greeks and the Jews and the Arabs and the devil knows who else from all ends of Europe and Duke Street. And the fowl market, all clucking outside Larby Sharon's, and the poor donkeys slipping half asleep, and the vague fellows in the cloaks asleep in the shade on the steps, and the big wheels of the carts of the bulls, and the old castle, thousands of years old, oh, yes, and those handsome Moors, all in white and turbans like kings, asking you to sit down in their little bit of a shop. And Rhonda with the old windows of the posadas, 2 glancing eyes, a lattice hid for her lover to kiss the iron. And the wine shops half open at night, and the castanets, and the night we missed the boat at Algeciras. The watchman was going about, serene with his lamp, and oh, that awful deep down torrent. Oh. And the sea crimson sometimes like fire, and the glorious sunsets, and the fig trees in the Alameda Gardens, yes. And all the queer little streets with the pink and blue and yellow houses, and the rose gardens, and the jessamine, and geraniums, and cactuses, and Gibraltar as a girl, where I was a flower of the mountain. Yes. When I put the rose in my hair like the Andalusian girls used, oh, shall I wear red? Yes. And how he kissed me under the Moorish wall, and I thought, well, as well him as another. Yes. To say yes, my mountain flower, and first I put my arms round him, yes, and drew him down so he could feel my breasts, all perfume. Yes, and his heart was going like mad, and yes, I said, yes, I will, yes.
And that wraps up our 2021 Bloomsday event. We hope that you've enjoyed the programme. We've certainly enjoyed putting it together for you. I would like to thank all of our contributors, actors and musicians for such wonderful performances. In particular, Arís Theatre performing artists Cara, Christina and Mary, Donal and the Catholic Shrine of the Immaculate Conception for the beautiful music and filming location, Geraldine Higgins of Emory University, author Nuala O'Connor, Kevin Fleming for production and graphics, and of course all of the team at the Consulate. Thank you for joining us and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Slán agus Bannacht live.